For the first time in 2 decades, the Oregonian has a new sports columnist. I'm Andrew Theen, and this is Beat Check with the Oregonian. Up next, a conversation with Bill Oram. We talked about his extensive experience covering the Los Angeles Lakers, why he wanted to come home to Oregon, what he thinks of some of the major stories in the sports landscape here today, and much more. A quick programming note, we talked right before, like minutes before, Damian Lillard signed a 2-year, $122 million extension. The existential questions, of course, about the Blazers and Dame's future are still relevant in NBA circles. Here's our conversation. Bill Oram, welcome back to the Oregonian, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
So this is full disclosure for listeners. We've never spoken, to the best of my knowledge. You've been a name and a face in the sports world and in the Oregonian world that I knew, but I don't think we've ever talked. So this is kind of a fresh take here. It's like we're sitting in the newsroom.
It's definitely the first day of school vibes and getting reacquainted with people I, was familiar with from, my past stint at the Oregonian and like you said, just from the sports world and following news in the state of Oregon. I'm from here, so I was always a close reader of the Oregonian and its writers.
Well, we're excited to have you, and it kind of sounds crazy when you say it, but this is the first new sports columnist at the papers in 2 decades. John Canzano is gone, so we figured this would be kind of a good way to introduce you to some readers and listeners. So you mentioned you're an Oregonian. Take us out to Tillamook County. What was young Bill Oram like? What was your path to journalism?
Well, I mean, it was always sort of toward this, at least in my dreams, right? Like I grew up, loving to write, loving sports. I mean, it's very much the cliche story of, playing sports, but not well enough to really do anything with it. And I really had my eyes open to the fact that sports writing could be a profession through reading the Oregonian every day. My mom was a school teacher, so I was always the first kid to get to school, and I would get in the building. I think probably in middle school in Beaver, Oregon, 15 miles south of Tillamook, there would be that fresh stack of newspapers that was delivered to the school before anybody got there. And I got to be the person who snipped the ribbon off the paper, and I would take the one off the top and always open right up to sports. And I would read, some of the great, Oregonian sports writers of the 90s. Jason Quick was there, Rachel Bachman was there, Paul Bucher, John Hunt, and obviously the columnists were hugely inspirational to me and must reads. When Chuck Culpepper arrived, I remember reading his takes on Oregon sports and just thinking he had such an incredible command of language, and it felt like such an adventure to read any column that he wrote, because it was fun. It was just a fun experience to get up in the morning and read that. And then Canzano came in and it was the same. I mean, obviously a different style, but such command over the material. And so, those two, as well as, really anybody else who came through the newsroom in those years, did have a real influence on me. And I remember looking up to Oregonian sports writers as celebrities. I mean, I cringe at the idea that if anybody could go back and search their email inbox from like 2000 at the emails they would have from me, just lavishing praise and asking for advice. But, Katie Muldoon used to be a reporter at the Oregonian. And I remember she wrote me a really long email explaining once, some of the things I should do if I wanted to become a journalist. And, I saved that email, forever. I think I have it in a box somewhere still. And, it was the same with other reporters. Abby Haight, who was a news reporter at the Oregonian, was really kind to me at one point. So, to be in this position now, and for you to say, the first new sports columnist in 20 years is like, that gives me chills, because I have such an incredible reverence for the institution of the Oregonian, but most especially for, the position of the sports columnist. And so to be here now, to have gone off, and I think we'll talk more about this, but like to have gone off and covered other things and been away from Oregon, and to now have the opportunity to come back, it's just such an incredible privilege and an honor, and one that I'm excited to get back, to get started on.
Yeah. So I guess that's a good segue to the media landscape for everyone listening to this and people working in the business, it's ever shifting. And it's like, you've worked for metro dailies, you've worked for big metro dailies, you've worked for new media startups that are acquired by, the venerable New York Times, coming from The Athletic. So what interests you about being a sports columnist in today's media landscape? Back at a paper that you worked at previously and that you talked about venerating so much.
Yeah. So so my path, real quick, because I left this out of the previous answer, was I, kind of got my start in Salt Lake City covering high school sports and did a bunch of stuff in Salt Lake, up until I was covering the Utah Jazz, left there to go to the Orange County Register, and then The Athletic covering the Lakers for the last 9 years. So that, that has really been an eye-opening sort of journey in terms of, from keeping your own stats, covering high school football in the snow in Utah, to, watching LeBron James score, 50 points, watching Kobe score 60 points in his last game, getting stared down by Russell Westbrook. So it's been a really fulfilling path. And I've even when I was with The Athletic, and obviously newspapers have continued to evolve, like you said, and gotten smaller, I always feel like the voice of the columnist in a city is so important. The opportunity to sort of set the agenda for sports news in that town. I think readers and fans still look to a columnist who earns their trust. Obviously, it's not about the position, it's about the person and the relationship that columnist establishes with the readership. But I think that is still one of the most special relationships that could exist in journalism. And, in terms of, actual column writing, that's sort of what I grew into at The Athletic. I wrote a lot of opinion and a lot of perspective pieces on the Lakers. And, I loved that. And they gave me the freedom to do that because that's not necessarily what I was hired to do. But I sort of expanded beyond just daily beat coverage to having a more, refined perspective. And, now the opportunity to expand that beyond I'm very comfortable with in an area I know really, really well, to, other sports and other teams that I feel connected to because I grew up here, because I grew up in South Tillamook County and, would rush home from basketball practice to watch the Ducks and Beavers play, because of that connection. Like, I do feel like, it's interesting. I feel like I'm not new, but because I haven't covered those teams, I do feel like I'm going to come at it with a new perspective. And that's a really exciting opportunity to come back and tell the stories of teams and communities that I care about and love, but with fresh eyes. And so that's what excited me about this specific opportunity. In addition to just having a really high regard for, the great sports columnists who continue to do great work at daily newspapers.
I want to get to all the local teams in a second, but I think it's, the Lakers are obviously one of the most iconic sports franchises in the world. And you covered them during a very weird, very weird time. When you look back at, when you get a little separation, like what kind of big moments, I guess, will stand out to you? Because obviously the bubble and the pandemic, and the LeBron title, but the Kobe situation. What are you going to take away from that experience? Because it's got to be just a bizarre one.
Yeah, it's kind of what I take away from it in totality, because it was such an unfamiliar dynamic for me going in, and I wasn't familiar with people with or around the Lakers. I never worked in a media market like Los Angeles before. I'd never competed against reporters like Mike Bresnahan and Dave McMenamin before. That just felt like, really raising the bar professionally. And I went in there, at 26 years old, maybe, feeling, like very much like a fish out of water and out of my depth, and kind of growing to a point where I had, where I felt like I was, by the end holding my own and hopefully then some, was a really fulfilling sort of stretch of time. But like you said, probably the strangest 10 years that anyone could cover the Lakers in franchise history. My first season was right after Kobe tore his Achilles tendon, which, the Lakers were trying to sort of salvage, more championship years out of Kobe's career. Mm-hmm. And when he tore his Achilles, they were really trapped in this purgatory of, well, is he going to be able to come back and keep playing like Kobe, or is this the end? And the answer was that it really was more or less the end. And so he kept kind of trying to come back and then had additional injuries. And so covering that team sort of when there was kind of the messaging of like, hey, we're trying to win, but there was the reality of they couldn't win. That was a very awkward time. And then there was the infusion of youth, the lottery years, the tanking years, getting all these young players like Brandon Ingram and Julius Randle and D'Angelo Russell and Lonzo Ball, trying to build a new foundation, and then basically throwing all that, cashing in on all that, all those assets when they had the opportunity to add Anthony Davis and once LeBron James had come. But to see the Lakers go from, really what you would consider to be rock bottom after Kobe's injury and no clear path forward, and free agents from, Carmelo Anthony to LaMarcus Aldridge to Greg Monroe are telling the Lakers they're not interested, to then see them start to grow organically. And it felt like they had something building, to then say, oh, wait a minute, we're the Lakers. Let's just get LeBron and then win that way, was interesting. But, I have a real, love-hate's not the right word, but complicated relationship with the Lakers, because I, have so much respect and admiration for the history of the Lakers and for so many of the people who are there. I think Jeannie Buss is just an incredible human being and owner. But at the same time, I feel like the Lakers keep tripping over their own feet, where they are so tunnel visioned on getting the next star, or on getting on taking the fastest path to winning, that I feel like they miss steps, and then they fall into potholes that they dug for themselves. And so last year, them not being successful when they had gone out and signed a bunch of guys who were good 6 years ago was not surprising. Having injuries, to guys like Trevor Ariza, was not surprising. Blazer fans who watched Kent Bazemore 3 years ago were not surprised that he wasn't particularly effective with the Lakers. So I sometimes question their management, and I sometimes wish that they could take a more holistic approach to team building, but also you lose the ability to do that when you have LeBron James at 38 years old trying to still win. And they went through that with Kobe too. So, I mean, I as much as I get frustrated by it, I do understand it.
Well, let's stick with the NBA, because
I will never understand the Russell Westbrook trade.
Yeah.
Let me just say, I will never understand the Russell Westbrook trade. It was dumb when they did it. It's dumb now. And if they get bailed out and are able to trade him for Kyrie Irving, and Kyrie shows up and is suddenly a model citizen, it would be the most Laker thing ever to actually get away with the Westbrook trade and then find a way out of it. That would be the sort of luck that only the Lakers get.
Yeah, go back in time not too long, the Pau Gasol trade, which left most people in the league scratching their heads and led to a couple titles. So anyone who follows me or listens to me on this podcast or anywhere else knows that I love the NBA. And so you have covered multiple franchises and been around the association for a long time now. So let's just stick with the NBA. I mean, what is the outside perception of the Blazers, I guess, that you heard from your seat down there? And then what do you make of this franchise, which, obviously there's the Ducks and the Beavers and whatnot, but I mean, this is kind of in many ways, the lifeblood of the state in the sports world. And it's a fascinating time. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, it is a fascinating time, and I like the moves that they've made this offseason. I think Jeremy Grant is a really good fit, and, I think he's a good fit next to Dame, and he's a guy who's coming in after having been the number one option for a couple of years. He doesn't have to be that anymore, but he's also not going to be the sixth man that he was in Denver. But, I mean, the Blazers just have big questions to answer. And obviously one of those is ownership. Jody Allen, has insisted that the team isn't for sale, but at the same time saying that the trust can be dissolved over 15 to 20 years isn't good enough. The NBA is not going to let, the Blazers sort of flap in the wind for 15 to 20 years while Paul Allen's trust gets sorted out. That requires a more decisive outcome one way or the other. And, when you look at, on the court, the biggest issue is Damian Lillard. And, he's young. He's 31, I believe. He is in the prime of his career, and he has shown an uncommon loyalty to the Blazers. And the the eternal question the Blazers are going to have to answer is, can they assemble a championship team without trading Damian Lillard? Can they build a team around him, or is the path forward to take the step back of trading him, like we've seen, franchises around the league do? And obviously Dame is committed to the Blazers. The Blazers have said they're committed to him. And so if that's the case, I think they've made productive steps, to build as good of a team as possible around him. I like the two-way talent. Josh Hart obviously had a great second half of the season. Gary Payton, Jeremy Grant. I mean, those are really good impact, high level role players. But the Dame question is going to be eternal, I think. And, he's eligible for an extension this summer. Everyone expects him to sign it. But what is the ceiling? And I don't know how many more years of, 500, 7 seed, that the Blazers can keep asking themselves those questions, because, and the other thing that I think about a lot, Andrew, and maybe you have thoughts on this too, is what is the value of a superstar who really wants to be your superstar and wants to be here, especially in a market like Portland, where the only path really to getting a player of that caliber is through a trade or draft. What is the value of that kind of commitment and loyalty relative to a championship? Because, trading Dame does not necessarily guarantee you a championship. If it did, you would do it, of course. But part of sports fandom is the struggle. And, Blazer fans know all too well that part of being a fan is not winning. And, getting so close to the mountaintop, whether it's 2000 or 92 or 90, and feeling like it's going to happen and then it doesn't, is having a superstar who wants to be part of that struggle with you more meaningful than maybe what the analytics say you should do, or what the wonky trade machine, could get you. And that's something I think about a lot, because I mean, when the Blazers traded, Clyde Drexler, that was viewed as doing right by Clyde. He was ready to go get a ring, and he was more or less the same age as Dame is now, I believe.
I think so.
Had obviously had more success, team success. But he wanted to leave, and that sort of allowed the Blazers to turn the page and retool. But if Dame is not in that same place and he wants to be here, and it's just understanding the way the market responds to the Blazers and responds to loyalty, I think you have to stick with the guy who wants to ride with you. Like that's a rare thing to find here.
Yeah. When I think of in my life, as a Oregonian, I grew up in Bedford. The point that I was most distant in my fandom is the years that they were, the absolute worst, and the Victor Kriapa and Sergei Monia and, the teams that, was.
Ooh, you're digging
yeah,
deep.
I mean, and what's the thread there? There is no star. I guess if you're retooling in this era, maybe it's somewhere in between the, trading Clyde. There's still a lot of veteran talent on that team. Trading Dame, if that were to come to pass at some point, you have young and promising players, unlike the Victor Kriapas of the world. But
Right.
But the sting, I think, would be
one thing. The sting would be significant, and one thing that people around the league always say is, the worst place you can be in the NBA is in the middle. You either want to be really good or you want to be really bad, so you can get really good. And the Blazers, I think, have been pretty locked in the middle, and they have built a team for next year that is going to be in the middle. And I guess I just have more respect for. I think there's a nobility to wanting to be in the middle, and wanting to grind and wanting to compete and wanting to be a tough out, and because being bad to be good it doesn't, especially when you can't also have a confidence that you're going to be able to lure free agents. Draft picks only go so far. Like the Lakers could get bad to get good, because they could say, once we have some talent, guys are going to want to come here. And that's true. And just historically, that hasn't been the case in Portland. Historically, the Blazers have not been able to attract, the high end unrestricted free agents. I think that is a more dangerous game to play when you're in a position like Portland, where, hey, maybe you go out and you win 50 games with Dame and Jeremy Grant and this, kind of thorny, tenacious defensive team. And then guys do want to come here. And maybe you are attracting more high level role players who want to come on the mid-level to Portland instead of, say, Houston. Create an environment the guys want to come to, I think, is a perfectly reasonable strategy.
All right, let's take a quick break, and then we're going to talk a bit more with Bill Oram, the new sports columnist for The Oregonian and Oregon Live. So, Bill, when you were at the O previously, you covered local government, among other things, right? No?
I did cops and courts.
Cops and courts. All right.
Cops and courts in the West Bureau. Yeah.
Westie. I was also a Westie. We were commiserating about that. Those old days that are long gone. But I'm curious. So how did covering local institutions, how do you bring those skills and then covering a $1 billion enterprise like the Lakers, are there any commonalities there that you can pull from to kind of that you'll draw from as you're kind of cutting your teeth as a columnist for the Oregonian? Are there any commonalities or things you'll try to bring to readers there?
Yeah, the through line is journalism. Not to be cheesy or high and mighty about it, but in sports, we're still journalists. I got into this business because of a love of reporting, of making phone calls, of seeking information and truth. And, those days in the West Bureau working for Tom Maurer was my editor out there. He gave me, really great opportunities and that I didn't even recognize at the time, but he challenged me as a reporter because, my first day on the cops beat, even there was a murder suicide in Tualatin, and I was sent out to the medical clinic in Tualatin and had to find things out about, this tragedy that had unfolded in our coverage area. I spent the next several months, knocking on doors of families of murder victims, of murderers, of, going to crime scenes, talking to the police. And that was just so far out of my comfort zone at the time. I had sports internships. I'd been the editor of my college newspaper and written columns, going after the director of residence life for overcrowding the dorms. That was my journalistic existence up to that point. And so the opportunity to do, real, boots on the ground journalism that was not sitting in a press box and not waiting for a box score to be handed to you, really challenged me and has really shaped me as a reporter. And so because of that, I'm so much more comfortable going into unfamiliar spaces, knocking on doors as a part of our profession, whether you're in, sports or not. And so, that's sort of the backbone of what I, intend to bring to this new role. And listen, there's no shortage of serious news stories happening, under the umbrella of sports in the state of Oregon. I mean, you look at the scandals that have unfolded with the Timbers and Thorns over the last year. Obviously, the ownership situation with the Blazers. There's been some reporting out there about Jody Allen that's going to require significant follow-up. And then obviously the state of the Pac-12, I mean, which might be the most disruptive story for Oregon sports in our lifetimes, completely changing the structure of how we think about our sports institutions. If you take the balls away, those are significant news stories. I mean, they are the kinds of stories you see in government, whether it's issues of abuse of power, harassment, and then institutions,
money.
There you go. That's the one that you see in almost everything. Money always talks. And one journalism lesson I learned at the University of Montana was if there's money in this story, put it up high, because that's always at the heart of things. Yeah.
Imagine when you took this gig, Bill, you didn't think that, at some point a visit down to the Rose Bowl or to the Coliseum might be the last one, for the foreseeable future in the football world. What do you make of this seismic shift? Was there any inkling when you were down there that LA schools wanted out? Any scuttlebutt about that?
No. I mean, I think, the reaction of the people I know who are close to the programs at USC and UCLA was just as much surprise as the people I know at Oregon and Oregon State. just like you said, seismic has completely rocked college sports. It's so depressing for me as somebody who grew up and understands the role that the USC and UCLAs of the world play for Oregon and Oregon State. Like Oregon State's football history, like its best moments, I mean, almost exclusively are when they beat USC in at various points, whether it was, those teams in the 60s, or
the Giant Killers.
It was the Giant Killers. Yeah. And then obviously the Jaquiz Rogers team, his coming out, the kind of opportunity to punch up and knock out those titans or perceived titans of the college football landscape, is a huge part of being Oregon State. And obviously Oregon has not only closed that gap and in some ways exceeded and in many ways exceeded those programs in terms of success. I mean, by far over the last 2 decades, but those were the tentpole schools of the Pac-10, Pac-12, and they go away, and it takes away a whole lot of the identity, I think, of being one of the other schools in the conference. And that's something that I think we're all going to have to readjust to, is sort of what it means to be in this conference when, those schools aren't there anymore.
I know anytime you start a new beat, having done it many times as you have, that, you try not to have any preconceived notions about what the stories might be or who you need to get to know or whatnot. But I mean, what kind of stories are you eager to tell when you think about, your new position, and what kind of columns, I guess, if you can speak again after I just set you up saying we try not to do that. But I mean, what can people expect from reading a Bill Oram column in the Oregonian?
Yeah. I mean, I hope it's going to be some of everything. I mean, I don't want it to be a formula. I want to get to know the athletes of this state and tell their stories, but also the fans. And, if there is a sports connection to something that is happening in a community, I want to tell that story, whether it's, in the smallest town in Oregon or on the biggest stage of the NBA. And so, if there is a story happening in someone's community, I would love to hear about it. But I also, and I think I've shown in my time covering the Lakers, unafraid to challenge, authority and institutions when that is merited. But, this is not going to be a situation where I'm just going to, be knocking, institutions and constantly pointing out their flaws. Like, I am very proud to be an Oregonian. I'm proud to have a chance to have a voice on the institutions of Oregon sports and to celebrate their best moments and the people who help them materialize. And so I'm going to be looking for those stories, whether it's at a game, whether it's at a practice, whether it's on the highway between Corvallis and Eugene. If I'm on the road and I see, something that seems like there might be a sports story in a pasture, I'm going to go find it. So I'm just excited to, dig into the state. I've identify so deeply with Oregon. Grew up, my father was a district ranger in the U.S. Forest Service on the coast. I am an 8th generation Oregonian. My family came over in 1845 on the Oregon Trail. My great, however many greats grandfather helped cut the Barlow Trail with Sam Barlow. This is in my blood. It's in my DNA. And so the opportunity to tell the stories of this place I love is like jet fuel for me. I am so excited to be in this position and have the opportunity and tell stories that hopefully no one else is seeing and no one else is ready to tell, but I am.
Well, we're excited to read your stuff, and I appreciate you taking time to chat and look forward to meeting you in person.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. Expect to see more of Bill in print, online, and in the podcast world very soon. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It really helps others find the show. And tell a friend. Help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism is through a subscription to Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time.